Okay, welcome to Unit 1, Geography and its Nature and Perspectives, Lecture 1. In this lecture series, I'm going to do an overview of some of the main concepts from the AP Human Geography course. So you should be taking notes as we go along, and let's begin. So the first thing I want to just talk about is the notion of geography and how it's defined. As you guys have probably read, the term geography comes from a word coined by the Greeks from Greek and Latin, geo meaning earth, and graphia meaning writing. So literally it means like writing the earth or earth writing. And most of the time when people think of geography, they think of maps and map making, and that certainly is a large portion of what geography is about. But it's about also a lot more than that. There are a lot of topics and issues that geography has a great deal to contribute to. Politics, history, mathematics, economics. There are any literature, any number of topics that really relate directly to geography and who geographers relate directly to. And geography itself is a specific study that is focused on notions of where. Contemporary geography focuses on looking at location and distribution. Where on the planet are things located? And also, how are the things happening on the planet affecting the lives of the people living there? Right now in contemporary geography, one of the major topics is globalization versus local diversity. Globalization is a really complex force that is affecting the world in a lot of different ways. Globalization relates to the outsourcing of jobs, people working and living overseas, global travel, global environmental issues. Globalization can relate to things as maybe simple as what do you do with the computer products that you throw away? What's happening to those kinds of things? How are the export of our trash, especially e-waste and things like that, affecting environments in other parts of the world? That's a globalization force. It's this modern movement where we have a much more interconnected world. And one of the probably most prominent writers on this topic is a man named Friedman. And Friedman wrote a book called The World is Flat, and how the process of globalization is actually leveling the playing field for a lot of people around the world. But in a geographic sense, globalization is also affecting people because it is interconnecting us in entirely new ways. The fact that we have McDonald's, for example, all around the world is this force of globalization, meaning that we have these similarities, these similar experiences and connections through a place and products that are produced by a corporation like McDonald's. The same thing can be seen in fashion or in films. When you look at a film that was really popular a few years ago, Slumdog Millionaire, that was the sort of westernization of an Indian film genre called Bollywood. And Westerners, people who live in the Western world, Western Europe, North America, were introduced to this sort of new thinking about film and story and this Bollywood way of thinking through this contemporary film. So again, it's this new interconnectedness. It's the fact that when the global markets crashed in 2008, in the United States, it didn't just affect the U.S. and the U.S. mortgage industry. It also led to a collapse of a sovereign debt crisis in places like Europe because economic markets are so deeply intertwined. So that's a real sort of specific or maybe a detailed discussion about what globalization is. And geographers are concerned with globalization because it affects the world and geography in a number of ways. But geographers are also concerned with local diversity because as globalization and the forces of globalization hit, it changes the local diversity, meaning how diverse places are at a more local level. We have, for example, products like Coca-Cola that are really acceptable all around the world. Everybody knows Coca-Cola, and that's something that is kind of ubiquitous, and it has been since the 1960s. A corporation, Coca-Cola, is proud to say it has actually infiltrated almost every single nation in the world. But what happens to local tea markets in a place where Coca-Cola becomes the preferred drink? For centuries in India, young people drank tea, and tea was produced in the region and was the most popular drink. But once Coca-Cola came in the 1960s, the tea drinking in India actually decreased, in particular in young people. Coca-Cola specifically advertised to young people. And so you have tea farmers who are actually affected now, and the diversity of people and their thinking and the foods that they're eating and the tea that they're drinking changes because of this force of globalization. And so looking at those kinds of things is something that geographers do on a regular basis. And one last thing on this page is to talk about the difference between physical geography and human geography. In this course, we're talking about human geography. It's the study of the way people live on the planet, where people live on the planet, the way that people are interacting with global forces and the global environment. Physical geography speaks more to the actual names of places and phenomenon, around the globe. So those two examples of geography are both relevant, but we're focusing mostly on human geography in this course. We're going to talk about a lot of vocabulary in this course, but the initial 5 really important concepts within geography is place, region, scale, space, and connections. Every single thing that will be talked about in this human geography course will in some way relate to one of these categories. As a matter of fact, at the end of this course, if you were to go through every topic that we studied, you would actually be able to put all of them into one of these categories. When we talk about place, we're going to talk about where things are located. And place, as well as region, scale, space, and connections, all of these things help us describe the uniqueness of the planet. That's what geographers want to do. So where on the globe is something located, or where is a phenomenon happening? When we're talking about region, we're also talking about another element of uniqueness. So what are the cultural forces that are at play in different parts of the world? For example, in the north central United States, that's a region. So we're from the upper Midwest here at Lodi High School. And that region has specific cultural components. We have a dialect that we speak. We even have certain language components that we speak. If you talk to someone who lives outside of the northern Midwest, they will actually point out to you how your language is different from theirs. There are phrases, and I like to play especially on these phrases because I think it's always sort of funny, like, oh yeah. Yeah. If you go further and further up into northeast Wisconsin, you're going to hear these phrases become more and more prominent. But also, if you think about the cultural components of region, like religion and foods and the kinds of things that people spend their time on, like sports, are all ways of describing a region. Scale is also a really important component of the geographer's vocabulary. So size and scale, especially in comparison. So we want to compare the scale of population and the numbers, essentially, of people and places on the earth. Space, how space is defined, how space is divided up, is another really critical component to geographical vocabulary. And then finally, the connections that exist between people and places is another key component in the geographer's vocabulary. So we're going to be looking at all kinds of connections that are made, political connections, geographic connections, as they relate to geography. So the number one tool of geographers are maps. And maps have 2 primary purposes. The first purpose of a map is for it to be used as a reference tool to find where you're going. I mean, how many times have you had to pull out a map? I mean, if you're at Disneyland, you're going to pull out a map so you can find where you're going. Or if you are driving down the road and you're trying to get somewhere you've never been before, using a map is a place to actually locate something. I know that in my life, I don't often pull out a paper map anymore. Often now I'm using an online map, and those maps are also for helping you find your way. But maps are also used to communicate ideas. So, for example, if you're looking at a population map, that map is not intended to show you where a specific location is, but rather the population map is intended to show you how population is distributed around the world. So maps can be used in two different ways. They can be used to help you find a specific location, but also to help you understand a concept or to show the distribution of certain kinds of features, physical or human, on the globe. And map making is extremely ancient. Some of the oldest maps, in fact, the very oldest map, Çatalhöyük, was the name of a Turkish town. And you can look on this, this screen, you can see to the left, there's actually an etching. The map itself was etched into a clay tablet. To the right is an artist's depiction giving you a clearer look at what Çatalhöyük actually looked like. And if you look at that map, you can see houses, you can see buildings, you can see a farm field. And this map is about 9,000 years old. So it's a pretty incredible thing to be seeing how people, even 9,000 years ago, were mapping out the planet. And look at the straight lines. The houses are, you know, blocked off in straight coordinates. So even 9,000 years ago, people were trying to organize space and come up with ways to define space and make things orderly, and using maps to help with that as well. The Babylonians also made their own maps. This is also a clay tablet showing a map made by the Babylonians around the year 2500 BCE. There are lots of famous examples of ancient maps, especially once Europeans began drawing maps. During the years of exploration in Europe, Europeans really enjoyed this map making experience. And looking at this map, I wonder if you can identify what you're looking at. It may be difficult to see, but what you're actually looking at is a map of North Africa, Europe, and parts of Western Asia. In the center to the left is the Mediterranean Sea, and the thing that kids and adults most often recognize is the boot of Italy hanging down into the Mediterranean. So you can see that while they had some things right, you know, they have the Red Sea, they have the Persian Gulf, size is certainly an issue, but these map makers did not have the benefit of GPS and other remote sensing kinds of map making software like we have today. Therefore, they had to actually make their maps while sailing along the seas, walking the land, and it led to a lot of distortion. But so too did the notion of ethnocentrism lead to distortion. People's tendency to focus their thinking on where they are from. And what we see in map making is that often ancient map makers made where they were from much larger and much more prominent than it literally is on the globe, because from their perspective, those places were larger, seemed larger. They had more detail about those places. So early map making is informative and helpful, but also has certainly some limitations. So next I want to talk about the different kinds of maps and the way that we sort of look at maps. Scale is a major issue with maps. You're going to have lots of different scale found on different maps. You have ratio or fraction scales that are giving you the size and sort of spatial relativity of different objects on the map. You can also have scale written, so written in words, and you can have it done as a graphic. And you'll see it written in a number of different ways. But also maps differ in their projections. The two maps that you're looking at here are two different projections of the globe. Because the planet is roughly a sphere, it's actually not a perfect sphere, but because it's roughly a sphere, when making a map, it's quite problematic because you end up with distortions of shape, you end up with distortions of distance, of size, and, oh, what's the last one I'm missing? And you also have these sort of tendencies towards, again, this perhaps ethnocentric nature of different maps. And that is one of the criticisms of the map that you're looking at here. Relative size, I'm sorry, you guys, I'm jumping around because I just, and direction, the distortions, I want to just make sure, and you have them in front of you so you can see them, but you have distortion of shape, distortion of distance, relative size, and direction are all important distortions to note when looking at map scale. Back to what I was saying just a moment ago, though. The two maps that you're looking at are kind of famous examples of how maps can look really different depending on how they are projected, how the cartographer or the map maker actually tries to account for these distortions. The map on the top is called the Mercator projection, and the Mercator projection is probably one of the most famous map projections. It was used throughout much of the middle part of the 20th century. What the Mercator map does is it tries to make longitude and latitude lines sort of adjusted for squares, or in some cases, as it gets closer to the poles, rectangles. And it basically tries to make those so longitude and latitude lines look nice and perfect and even. But what it does is it distorts for size. It distorts for distance. So you have this issue of projection with Mercator. One of the major complaints about the Mercator map isn't just that Greenland is gigantic compared to its actual size, but also that Europe and the United States, countries that in the middle part of the 20th century tended to be more dominant, had a lot more power, have a much larger presence than they actually do in terms of their relative actual size on the planet. And so it led to this accusation of, again, ethnocentrism. That because Mercator was a European, because the Europeans and the Americans were so dominant in foreign policy, that this actually reflected a somewhat racist or ethnocentric perspective on the globe. The Peters projection is the projection that you're looking at on the bottom, and the Peters projection adjusts to get the relative size in order, to have the size in order, but what it loses is shape. So you see the stretching of some places. But compare Mercator and Peters. It's pretty stunning, isn't it, how different they are. Look at Africa. Look at Mexico and Alaska. On the Mercator projection, Alaska looks way bigger than Mexico. But when you look at it on the more accurate, in terms of size, Peters projection, you can see that Mexico is actually larger than Alaska. Most people would be shocked to know that because we've grown up with this Mercator projection. So it's really important that we take a look at these kinds of projections so that we understand how they affect the way that we see the world and our understanding of the world. So, okay, I'm going to stop this lecture here, and in part 2 you'll hear the next bit. Okay, thanks.